this museum started as a result of an archaeological find that I made a long time ago. When I was 15 years old, we were digging peat and being interested in archaeology. I simply asked my father a question. We were walking home after digging peat at the end of the day, me and my parents, and I simply remarked on a stone that looked rather out of place. It was on the moor, an oblong stone. It wasn't, in my mind, it looked interesting. It wasn't a boulder as such as an erratic, left by the Ice Age. So I simply asked the question. I asked my father in Gaelic if it had any significance. Now, and to be honest, I don't remember my exact wording, but I distinctly remember his reply. He looked at the stone as he walked past, and he said, "Shinakat Clacha Nerekit," which translates as "that's the money stone." And he then related a really interesting story that went back to prior to 1913. He said that the previous tenant of the croft had been digging around that stone and probably digging under it, and he found earthenware pots, which he then sold to somewhere in Edinburgh, and that's how that stone got that name, the Money Stone. So he went on to say that that previous tenant of the croft had emigrated, in 1913. So we can date it, to prior to that year. And when my father mentioned pottery, ancient pottery, being interested in antiquity, I immediately knew that was archaeology. So I remarked to my father and mother. I said, "Oh, that's probably a burial, an ancient burial." And I still remember my father stepping back a couple of paces, and he said to me, "I don't want you to go digging there." But on hindsight, my father wasn't superstitious, but he did have absolute reverence, for any burial, regardless of age, regardless of archaeology. I said to him, "Oh, that's probably prehistoric. It's probably a few thousand years old." And he said, "Well, I don't care if it's 10,000 years old. I don't want you to go digging there." So I recall saying words to the extent, "Oh, well, I'll leave it for now." And I wrote to the National Museum in Edinburgh to see if they were the ones who had received, the earlier artifacts, the pots. And when I wrote to them, they were interested. So they replied to state that they hadn't any record of them, and they didn't seem too interested in coming to record the place. And as a 15-year-old, you can imagine, and being interested in archaeology, you can imagine how tempted I was. So probably against my father's wishes, I went up there and I laid a grid down beside the stone. I thought it was very advanced for the time. So I cut a square of turf, and I flipped it over, cut it with a trowel, flipped it over, and I was intrigued to find a small bit of pottery. I knew that was ancient. I recognised it as ancient pottery, and so I knew then. I still recall that feeling of euphoria, really. To find that little bit of ancient pottery, and I remember looking at it and seeing the markings on it. Unusual decoration, which I had never seen before. And the next turf I turned over. Euphoria doesn't quite do it, because I found an arrowhead, and I thought, the feeling that I had initially for the bit of pottery was eclipsed, by the feeling I got when I saw that tiny arrowhead. But although it was clearly in the shape of an arrowhead, it was so small that I wasn't 100% certain. So I took it home. I clasped it in my hand and I walked home. Our home was only minutes away, from the actual location. So I took it home. My father was reading the paper, and I reached over and I put it under his nose and I opened my palm, and he immediately said, "Arrowhead." Well, he said it in Gaelic. He said "sage," which is an obscure word to me. I'd never heard the word. It was Gaelic for arrowhead. And I said, well, what? And he then said, oh, arrowhead. I said, how do you know it's an arrowhead? Because it's so, so tiny. But he says, oh, as soon as I saw it, my memory came flooding back, and I recall that indeed arrowheads were found along with the pots. So I said, okay, fantastic. So my father took custody of the arrowhead, and I went back up to the location there and then, and in due course, I found 6 arrowheads scattered round about the stone. And then my father suggested that I should possibly speak to people in the area who may have remembered the previous find, which I did. I spoke to 2 individuals who were obviously elderly, but they both independently said that hundreds of arrowheads were found in that location. So that would have made it rather unusual. I've never heard of hundreds of arrowheads being found, in these circumstances. These were obviously grave goods. Pottery, arrowheads were commonly placed with the body as grave goods. I hasten to add there was absolutely no sign of any body remains. These ancient race often cremated the dead and put the ashes within the urn or the pot. And the capstone, as we call it nowadays, in modern terms, was just a marker for that spot. So that archaeological find of the early 1970s was crucial, to this museum happening. On the basis that, shortly after I found the arrowheads, I remarked to my parents that I would like to set up a museum. So I was extremely fortunate, to have their support in that manner, because they said, "Well, fantastic idea. You should really, think deeply about that." And in a few years, after a few years, I was up and running as a museum. Admittedly, I was still only a teenager, but I'd left school, at an early age, and. My parents probably thought, "Oh, fantastic! That'll keep you here." So that was really the start of it, and then being up and running, as a museum at that early age. Back then, it was a thatched cottage. That admittedly, there weren't a lot of items in it, and the building itself was really of huge interest to many people. But over the years, the fossil collection started to grow, and when I got this ancient ruin, in the late 80s, I restored it with a new roof, and obviously much of the stonework has had to be replaced. And I rehoused the collection in this building. I grew up in a croft here in Ellisheller, and on hindsight, what a fantastic upbringing. And obviously we weren't aware of it at the time. Children just aren't. So it's only in reflection that you realise the situation. But back in the 60s, as I was growing up, obviously as a child in the 1960s, crofting then was done in a very traditional fashion. There weren't any big tractors. Everybody had a little ferry tractor, small mowers. The climate seemed to be drier at the time. Everybody grew oats and hay, for their stock. And most summers, everybody managed to do so successfully. And a lot of people grew their own vegetables, and a variety of vegetables. It wasn't just potatoes, turnips and cabbage. There was a huge variety of vegetables. And almost everybody had a big crop of rhubarb. And it was crofting in those days was done in a really, a kindly and environmental fashion. Although fertilizers were used, admittedly, it was small scale fertilizing, unlike the bigger farms, of course. And every croft seemed to be neat and tidy. There was hardly any clumps of rushes back in those days. And I remember, some of these tools being used, and notably the hay knife. It had an extremely fine, sharp edge, and that was used for cutting the hay out of the stack. But I remember we didn't have one until we were adult. Our neighbour had one, and we could see him effortlessly cutting the hay out of the stack, and it would fall so neatly to the ground. It looked as if he was slicing a cake. And we would say to our father, "Why can't we have a hay knife like our neighbour? And it would be easier on our fingers. Our fingers used to get sore." And he would say, "Well, I'll wait till you're older, in case you lose any fingers." Yeah. Turf cutters. It's rather a modern version. Well, I think it's fairly modern because it's got Spear and Jackson on the stamped on it. It would be used for cutting the turf before the peat was cut. It was really for cutting the grassy part on top, which was always relayed back onto the locality where the peat was cut, for regeneration and growth. So it wasn't harmful to the environment. Well, peat cutting here was done on a domestic scale. We were all allowed to cut peat, although it's been banned in some parts nowadays, notably Ireland. I know Ireland is banning a lot of peat cutting, because of the release of carbon into the environment. Although it's a simple looking tool, it was used for quite an interesting purpose. It was a pick that was used to dig lignite from the Trotnish range, soft coal. There's a seam of lignite there, and it was actually surveyed in the 19th century by the landowner with a view to commercial extraction, but fortunately that never went ahead. Lignite. Yeah. Sheep shears, still used today. As you recall, I still shear sheep by hand. Universal tool, the adze. And again, a very simple implement, it's like a garden hoe. It was called a croman, a Gaelic word croman. That's quite an interesting one. It was used for spreading heath fires. Paraffin would be put in the tank, and a rag would be stuffed into the nozzle. And then you would spread the fire by holding it, running it along the ground. Turnip cutter. When you were feeding turnip to cattle, you had to chop the turnip into quarters, and that would allow the cow to grasp the turnip. Harrows for breaking up the soil after it had been ploughed, but this was manual. It was pulled by hand, especially if it was a potato patch. When the potatoes were planted, the crofters thought it was better just not to allow a tractor onto that ground for fear of compacting it too much. Or even a horse, a heavy horse might have compacted it a bit much, so they chose to pull it themselves. Now this is quite a curious looking implement. It's called a foot plough. When I place it in that position, it has a classic shape of a plough that you would expect to be pulled, by a small horse. But as I mentioned, it's a manual tool which was used in this fashion. The foot was placed on the peg, it was jabbed into the ground, and that was the heel which was then placed on the ground, and the clod of earth was literally ripped out of the ground and flipped over, plough is a bit of a misnomer. It didn't leave a furrow as you would, a straight furrow as you would with a normal plough. It was really a digging implement, similar to using a garden spade. And the peat iron, you see it's got a right angle blade. Once the grassy part stripped off on the top, that would be pressed into the peat, up to that depth, that's the width, and you had a slab of peat, that dimension, but that would then shrink down to half the size once it dried out. It's clearly the blunt end of an axe head. If you can see the wear marks on each side where it was being shaped, but obviously it would taper down to a sharp edge. And I found it when we were digging peat in 1984. It was one of the last times when we were digging peat, and I found it right at the bottom on the clay bed. So that would indicate that, we know axe heads are thousands of years in age, but this was on top of the clay. So this could possibly go back as far as 6,000 years old. To find something on the bare clay underneath, a metre of peat, and that takes, 5,000 or 6,000 years to grow, quite remarkable. You can see where I actually struck it with a spade. There's a tiny little mark on the top of it. It's very unusual to find anything on the clay. But one of the other unusual finds that I found in the same locality a few years earlier was a little cairn of stones, just only of that height, and it was really neatly constructed. And I thought when I came across it, I wonder if there's anything inside that. It was quite clearly constructed methodically, right down to the very last stone on the top in a pyramid shape, just less than a foot in height. And I took it apart stone by stone, photo by photo, to find that there was nothing inside it. So one wonders, why was that cairn made there? It could have been a child that was playing. It could have been a marker, for some other reason. But it's so intriguing. I found it in a rabbit hole, in a broch, an Iron Age fort. And this, when I found it, I couldn't be certain of its authenticity, but because it came out of the broch, the rabbit horn, and along with a couple of bits of pottery, I thought that's got to be associated with the Iron Age. And I had it there for decades until an archaeologist came in here, and she said, she practically said, "Oh wow, did you know there's less than 10 of these have ever been found in Scotland?" So I says, "No, I didn't know that." And so anyway, she persuaded me to part with it for isotope testing. She left, and then there's a series of emails that verified the situation, and so I gave it up for that isotope testing, and that's how I got that result back. It was verified as being made of tiny fragments of recycled bottle glass from the Eastern Mediterranean of the 1st century. It's easy to, I knew it was somewhere in between 100 BC, 100 AD, because most of these broths date from that period. But then to have it verified as this recycled bottle glass from 3 different bottles, she said, it would appear that there were people coming from there. Well, the Romans were here, not in the UK, in strength at that time, but not so much so up here. But and they have such an unusual thing to find. It just shows evidence of trading. And there have been locations found, in other parts of the UK, notably the Isle of Man, where the smelting process was being conducted. So, that's rather ordinary looking artifact is so rare. Although the stone looks a bit ordinary, when I found it back in 2001, all that was visible of it was that section. You can see the discoloration actually, and curiously, again, it was exposed by a rabbit in some ruins in Kilmalloog. It's just about 5 miles north of here. And when I spotted it, I thought, oh, that's a rotary sharpening stone. You get a lot of these, in association with ruins. They'd be mounted on a stand, with a rotary stand, for sharpening knives or razors even. When I prized it out, I thought initially that the whole stone might have been there, but then when I levered it, I could see it was loose, so I prized it out of the ground. But when I turned it over, I was absolutely intrigued to see that carving. As soon as I saw that carving, I thought of St. Malluag, one of the early Celtic saints, the contemporary of St. Columba, 6th century. As soon as I saw that, I thought, I'm on the site, the long lost site of St. Malluag. Throughout Scotland, or names associated with that Christian saint. It was only the monks, that carved, that worked objects in this manner, and in relief you can see it's raised in a chord fashion. Now this would represent a cross, the Christian cross. It would come to another, the cross beam, and to the upright. And the hole in the centre, for the axis, for the on which it rotated. But the hole in the centre is clearly where the monks of the time, where St. Malluag's monks put a stick and then rotated it with a stick, because you can see the wear within the hole that shows that was clearly the handle for turning it on a rotary fashion. There's a strong possibility that this rotary stone is deliberately broken, because the later version of the Christian Church, they weren't into ornamentation, even such as the Christian cross, and they may have just broken it, simply for that reason. Although the pot looks, fairly ordinary, it's known as cragganware. They're difficult to date because they were being made in the Highlands for over hundreds of years, dependent on the archaeological context in which they're found. Say, for example, if this was found in a broch, you could date that to about 2,000 years old. But this was an isolated find in a small cave in Staffin, which I found as a teenager. And when I found the cave, I could see evidence of pottery, scattered around. And I found this in a corner of the cave, and I took it home, showed it to my parents, and my father, who was obviously from this area, he immediately said, when I said cave, he said, "Oh, that'll be," he said in Gaelic, "Oh, Shinagad boy Nakash," which translates as, "Oh, that'll be the Easter Bothy." And he related that he was aware of a small cave and Staffin and the particular area where people went to celebrate Easter Sunday, and where they would boil shellfish, and they would take the usual boiled eggs with them, but also they would boil shellfish, and just to celebrate that Christian event. To this day, when I go out, on excursions with students or whatever, I get distracted as soon as I see broken ground. I think archaeology, possible archaeology. Usually you see nothing, but very occasionally, you see perhaps a bit of pottery sticking out of an embankment, or even if you're exceedingly lucky, you come across an arrow, albeit with a broken point. And now, a lot of people would dismiss that. If you're not archaeologically minded, you just don't see. You don't see the obvious at times, but flint does catch your eye, and in this case I saw it protruding out of one of these embankments in the local law, and it may have been discarded because of the broken point. After years of practice, your eyes do become accustomed to seeing the unusual, and you just bend down and have a closer look. This is a really rare example of a dinosaur's footprint. On the basis, there's something very unusual going on here. If we look closely, we see evidence of the young with the adult. I'm often asked, how can we tell that's young and adult, and how can we even tell that's an adult? But in the first instance, we have recorded hundreds of footprints of that exact same dimension, same length, same width, same splay of toes. So to find hundreds of the exact same size in different localities, that gives us the confidence to assume adult. But it's really the young, that makes this one special. It's a really rare example of seeing that. On a worldwide basis, there's not much evidence, of that. For generations, scientists, paleontologists thought that dinosaurs abandoned their young, as this, in the same manner that some species do nowadays. They lay the eggs and leave them. But that theory has been discounted, on the basis of specimens such as these, where it clearly shows young that is probably about a year old, following the adult. And once we start counting, we see about 8 or 9 different individuals. They overlap one another, and it's really a brood. That's my word. In fact, they did evolve into birds, at a later date. So the brood is fine. It's attracted huge attention, from the scientific world, and it's been on a few exhibitions. The specimen is real. It's often mistaken for a copy. Admittedly, it looks like a concrete cast, but the use of the word cast, it is the real cast. When I found this specimen, I found it at the right time. It had been newly exposed when a boulder had fallen apart on the shore, and I could see the positive and the negative. The positive being the indented print, and the negative being the mold which comes away. But the other slab was in such poor condition, I couldn't save it. It was very, very fragile, falling apart. But that led to the good preservation of the print. When you look closely, you see the fantastic detail around the toes. When the sediments broke apart, the other half crumbled rather than breaking away the edges of the sediment. When I found it, it was completely intact, and I know people wonder, what's caused the damage really, but during the process of extraction, it was inevitable. There was a hairline crack all the way around it, and when I inserted, small chisels all the way around it, give them each a tap to try and free it, from quite a deep rock. Unfortunately, as you can see, it's broken across the surface. But the scientists aren't too bothered by that, because they can study the sediment. They can look at the sediment and see what's going on, see what other minute fossils they find there. In other words, it's easier to study in sections than it would be if it was complete. Fortunately, it didn't crack across the main footprint. The species is thought to be Coelophysis. It's clearly a carnivorous species. The shape of the footprint, the length of the toes, that clearly gives us away as to the type. But it's such an early period in dinosaur evolution. It dates to the Middle Jurassic period of 166 million years ago. That's admittedly, the enormity of that period of time is rather difficult to equate even to the scientists. So there's less than 10 Middle Jurassic localities on the surface of the world. So that fact alone makes these of huge importance, international importance. The day we went down to recover that, I was with a young lad that I'd met here. Oh, he was only about 10, I think, when he came here with his parents, and he showed a really keen interest in fossils, and he kept coming back with his parents. So, I got to know him quite well over the years, and he's still coming back here, about 8 years later. And so I told him about this footprint, down in the shore. So he agreed to help me lift it out. But on the day in question, as you can see, there was a heavy swell on the shore, and so I told him to keep his feet dry. So I had wellies on and wet gear, as you can see. So I went to retrieve it, and I told him, if you see a big wave coming in, please let me know. And he didn't. And you can see by the grimace on my face, that salt water is pouring down the back of my neck. So when I straightened up, I says to him, "Oh, you didn't tell me that wave was coming in." He says, "Well, I'm sorry, but it would have spoiled the photo if I had."